Welcome to my presentation today. My name is Dr. Paul Waters. I'm an adjunct professor at Macquarie University in Sydney, Australia, and also an honorary professor at La Trobe University in Melbourne. The title of my presentation today is Cybersecurity Knowledge, Skills and Abilities, Designing Digital Education for the 21st Century. In my presentation today, I hope to be able to outline some of the key challenges for digital education, particularly during and after the COVID emergency. And also I want to reflect on the challenges for cybersecurity education specifically, also the digital delivery of cybersecurity education. Before I start my presentation, I just want to give a very brief biographical outline. As I indicated, I'm currently an adjunct professor at Macquarie University in Sydney, where I completed my PhD about 21 years ago. I'm also an honorary professor at La Trobe University in Melbourne, and I'm also the academic dean at Academies Australasia Polytechnic, which is an Australian Stock Exchange listed company which runs around 18 colleges in both Singapore and Australia. So in my role there as academic dean, I have oversight over a large number of academic matters, as well as trying to manage and organise a very large academic team of around 50 academics. And as you can imagine, during the COVID emergency, much like all other education providers in many countries around the world, we have had to very quickly transition from teaching in a classroom to teaching through digital education. At the same time, being a cybersecurity academic myself, I'm also concerned and interested and engaged in a number of projects around the futures for cybersecurity education. If there's one thing that we have learned during the COVID emergency, it is that digital education has become an overnight necessity. Across the world, schools, colleges, universities have closed their doors. It would be quite rare in any country at the moment for all students to be back studying on campus. And this has led to a fundamental reshaping of the way that we design and deliver education. Digital education has become the present, and no doubt even after COVID has passed, it will continue to become a very significant part of the future. So being a cybersecurity expert, I think one of the observations I've made is just how quickly cybersecurity issues have come to the fore in discussions around digital education. And in this talk, I'm going to try and cover what some of those fundamental security issues are, and hopefully outline what some of the potential solutions might be. I'm also going to briefly discuss some curriculum and pedagogical challenges, although I'm sure for this audience that none of these will be a surprise. For example, if you have designed a networking curriculum around students coming into a physical laboratory with benches and routers and cables and switches, how do you then switch that to a simulation environment? And will this simulated educational experience be equivalent to one which the students might have if they were in the physical classroom? I don't think asking those questions will come as a surprise, and certainly for our students, in many cases our customers, these are exactly the questions that they are also going to ask. I have seen on a number of forums students asking what I think is a very relevant question, which is, Should they pay cheaper fees, for example, if they don't get the full classroom experience? I think in many cases, universities and other education providers continue to charge exactly the same fees, irrespective of whether that classroom experience is delivered physically or virtually. And that, in a sense, is a marketplace decision. It's something that market forces will eventually determine whether, post the COVID emergency, students will continue to study online or whether they will move back to the physical classroom. In the second half of my presentation, I then want to cover off specifically what is the future of cybersecurity education, which really revolves around what the profession calls the skills crisis, which is that essentially we have nowhere near enough people working in cybersecurity to meet the labour-intensive demands of a very hungry industry. And this is forcing the profession to investigate new cohorts, more diverse cohorts from which we can draw future workers. And I'll briefly talk about some of my work in the neurodiversity area in trying to attract more people to work in the cyber profession. And you can imagine for potentially students who are on the autism spectrum who might find going to a physical classroom challenging, that they may in fact be more comfortable with a fully digitally delivered experience for their education and training. And so we may end up with a confluence of opportunities and available resources, which certainly wasn't envisaged when we've had this emergency move to online learning. I'm just going to briefly cover off some of my own personal experience in digital education and online learning, and I have to look back a very long time, 28 years ago, when I was working as a research assistant at the University of Newcastle in Australia, where I developed a pilot set of digital curriculum materials for a course in undergraduate psychology using hypertext. And at the time, Apple had a platform called HyperCard, which allowed hypertext implementations on the Mac platform. And HyperCard itself was a fantastic product, extremely innovative, and of course at the time this was very much in the infancy of the World Wide Web, so a theoretical construct like hypertext, which was implemented in both HyperCard and the web, was beginning to receive some attention. But the idea of delivering education through a HyperCard stack at the time was really something quite novel and was not very common at the time. We were still very much in the chalk and talk phase of a traditional university education. In the following couple of years, I worked with Kip McGrath Education Centres, again another company listed on the Australian Stock Exchange, to develop digital simulations for maths and English tuition. Kip McGrath is one of the world's largest tutoring companies, a private provider of tuition for particularly primary and high school students. And so I was trying to create these reusable materials that students at the Kip McGrath centres could then use to improve their maths and English skills. Again, using HyperCard, using ThinkC and a range of other technologies. Again, this was something that was quite novel at the time. I think went on to be quite widely used, and obviously these days with digital learning, digital textbooks, this kind of delivery is something which is reasonably common. After some time, I then went off to do some work with Jones International University, which was one of the first online universities in the US, sadly now no longer in business. And At the time, I had written a number of books on Unix system administration, and they were very keen to try and turn this into some kind of postgraduate master's course in system administration. I created 4 subjects as a major sequence, fully online, theoretical materials, practical labs, and it went really well. After that, when I came back to work at Macquarie University, I worked on the first fully online graduate certificate of ICT to be delivered in Australia. And again, the idea here was to try and retrain people who may already have a degree in another discipline to try and become ICT workers. And so after perhaps 1 or 2 years of full or part-time study, students would have all of the foundation skills required to become an ICT professional. At La Trobe University, I then worked on the fully online Master of Cybersecurity degrees. When these were first launched and developed, we had degrees for cybersecurity in law, business operations, and computer science. Sadly, after only a relatively short amount of time, these degrees were discontinued by the university. And most recently, and I provided a link for this in the presentation slide, I've been working on the design of Genius Armory, which is an educational program for cybersecurity designed to try and develop an interest in cybersecurity, particularly for people on the autism spectrum. So this is just a small subset of my experience in working with digital education over the years. I guess as a result of that experience, I've come across a number of different challenges, and I'm just going to go through these. Again, I suspect for this audience, we've all come across a very similar set of challenges. And probably the first thing is, how do you create exciting and engaging content? I know lectures tend to have a bad rap these days, and in many institutions, ensuring a high level of student attendance at lectures remains a challenge. But the biggest issue, I think, for digital is trying to create that sense of excitement and delivery that you might get from a very skilled lecturer. And so when you go to a world-class lecture, it's exciting, it's engaging, it's interactive. You have that sense of talking to a real expert. You can ask questions, and it's a very synchronous mode of delivery, whereas digital by its nature, and particularly for the delivery of digital content, tends to be asynchronous. So someone has pre-designed and pre-recorded lecture content, which is all delivered in a fairly standard way, very much like the presentation I'm giving today. And for some people, that might lack the spontaneity and that creative context where you bring together a group of learners with that very experienced academic. I think the other thing, of course, is that trying to maintain and increase student motivation where they are physically isolated from other students can be very difficult. And again, if your content's not engaging and the instructional design is not poised to engage students directly, this can also become a problem. There can also be technical challenges and limitations, as I note below. The main one is that not every student has a smartphone or a computer to be able to access the platforms that a school or a university might be relying on. There could be issues around browser compatibility. There could be antivirus scanners preventing software from running. So it's quite difficult to provide the level of ICT support remotely that students might need, particularly if they can't come in and visit a help desk with their phone or their laptop. think it's also fair to say that there are a range of generational expectations with the current set of learners that we have. If you are a digital native, if you're a millennial, you might be looking for more of that Instagram or Facebook style experience, which is, very visual, short chunks, not much text. And that could be vastly different to someone who's, say, coming into a digital postgraduate degree, who's had a traditional undergraduate experience, which is more chalk and talk, which is more reading and analysing and writing long responses. So, an instructional designer needs to really consider these issues when trying to create a course which caters to the needs and expectations of a range of generations. Volume of learning can also be a huge challenge. I think when you can neatly chunk everything into, a weekly 2-hour lecture, a weekly 2-hour lab, you can be assured that people are essentially being delivered and engaging in the same volume of learning. Whereas when people are working through slides where they don't have that cohort effect of sitting in a classroom, some people might zoom ahead, some might lag behind, and it could be quite difficult for a lecturer to really understand where the class is at without getting that kind of instant feedback. Curriculum challenges abound in digital education, particularly I think in fields like networking or coding or anything that requires some kind of physical activity. Sometimes doing that in a simulated online environment doesn't give you that same kind of hands-on experience, and that in itself can then perhaps limit the effectiveness of curriculum. Also things like group work. I think where you have academic groups that come together and they can perhaps meet informally over a coffee and bond together and build that social cohesion, where you only have an online environment, I think that definitely remains a challenge to try and, build that team spirit and to be able to monitor each other's progress. I think, some professionals can do this quite well, particularly coders who are working in a distributed format and they've got, technical support to kind of check in and track changes and maintain versions and so on. Students don't always have that level of maturity. Another point is that, academics are probably experts in their field of study, but they might not always be experts in instructional design, and so institutions might need to employ or engage a large number of instructional designers to provide professional support to academics, which was extremely difficult during the COVID emergency, where many institutions had to transition to fully online pretty much overnight. I think trying to find the right platforms that suit a range of different learning needs and styles can be important, and which also then align to the course outcomes that might be specified can be a challenge. And also I think just really basic things like, how do you train a student to use an LMS, for example, without a teacher physically being there? So that kind of bootstrapping element of getting them even onto the system in the first place. For those of us who've been teaching during the COVID emergency, I'm sure that some of these security challenges that I'm going to outline will have been experienced by a number of you. So these include things like Zoom bombing, for example, where, an attacker or some kind of malicious person decides to, perhaps randomly generate a Zoom meeting ID and connect, and they then are able to not just listen in on a class, but also to take control and share illegal or inappropriate materials. In many cases, early on in COVID, this was happening fairly continuously, and I'm sure that there will be a number of criminal investigations that will arise from that. But, there are some fairly serious consequences. I mean, in some classes, people might be sharing personal data, for example. If someone's able to join a Zoom session, they might be able to view student IDs, for example, or they might be able to find links to course materials and intellectual property, which could then be stolen. So there's a whole range of concerns, I think, around unauthorised disclosure during Zoom bombing. Also, I think there's often a lack of access control. I mean, students can pretty much in these chat windows type in whatever they like, perhaps before a teacher can review it. It's also not clear that when someone connects that it might actually be that person. It could be a third party refusing to put their camera on and impersonating someone else. And finally, we then have really, in terms of the integrity of the assessment process, really fundamental issues like how do you invigilate an exam where someone is sitting behind a computer and typing the responses in, but where you can't necessarily see their full screen. You might be able to see the person, but what's to stop that person having someone sitting in front of them, Googling solutions for them. There's a whole range of challenges that really have yet to be solved in terms of invigilating assessments in digital education. It's certainly no surprise, I think, to this audience that, whenever you put a service online like education, that there is the potential for remote takeovers, for remote access Trojans, particularly where people install applications or services inappropriately with the wrong access controls, the wrong permissions. Even in very common learning management systems like Moodle, there was a vulnerability, a serious remote access vulnerability which existed for more than 6 years. So, where you are moving this type of LMS to be front and centre, it's really important that that basic cybersecurity practices and safeguards are put in place. A further complication is that for digital education, there's often a lack of integration between the different tools which are used. So learning management systems are not always integrated with video conferencing systems. They might have different authentication systems. They might have static links which embed passwords and which are passed between applications. They might require third-party apps to be installed, and some of these could be compromised. So this is a veritable Aladdin's cave for attackers to try and penetrate our universities. And what we know from some of the case studies on things like state-sponsored hacks is that universities are often very much seen as soft targets, as sources for intellectual property theft. And so it's really important that as we progress down this COVID emergency pathway, that institutions take the time to understand their risks, to understand how to configure these systems and software correctly, and also to educate users about the way that they should also be interacting with and installing the appropriate software. So I think they're the basic challenges around digital education and cybersecurity. I now want to move on to what are the education challenges specifically for cybersecurity. I think both in general and also specifically with regard to digital education. And I think there's an open question around what is the best approach really for educating future workers around cybersecurity. In Australia, for example, we have the Australian Qualifications Framework, which is a 10-level set of qualitative descriptors that describe everything from a Certificate 1 through to Certificate 4, which is our vocational levels, followed by diploma, advanced diploma, at some kind of intermediate stage between vocational and higher education, which is bachelor's, master's and doctorates, broadly speaking. And There's often a debate in Australia about whether you should have a very broad undergraduate education followed by a professional postgraduate degree, which is very common in the United States, or more traditionally in Australia we might have quite a specialised undergraduate degree. At the same time, the way that we train people in cyber is quite hotly contested. There are a number of commercial providers, international bodies who themselves create certification programs which are highly targeted and which are often claimed to be the equivalent of undertaking a master's degree in cybersecurity. I personally don't believe that for a minute, particularly when you look at the depth and the volume of learning, but nonetheless these claims are out there, and it really does beg the question, what is the best type of learning for cyber? Is it better to focus on theory versus practice? Is it better to have hands-on learning in a laboratory, or are virtual labs sufficient? Can you then take that theoretical learning and apply it into a workplace using a traditional internship? Or can you use some kind of virtual internship where you might have a virtual experience set up by a number of different companies and you can cycle through a whole range of internships? So I think these are definitely different approaches that are being taken and experimented with around the world. I don't think there's any right or wrong answer as such, but I think one of the great innovations that has occurred over the past few years has been the development of the NICE framework by NIST, the national standards body in the United States, and for the first time this actually set up a number of high-level categories, low-level categories for occupations within cybersecurity, which are then mapped to a standardised set of knowledge, skills and abilities, the KSAs. And so really for the first time you're able to say if you're something like a security analyst versus a forensic investigator, what are those specific KSAs that you have in common? What are the ones that are specific to all of the different roles in cybersecurity? And so if you've got more than 50 of these role descriptions, I think one of the things that I find a challenge to understand is how can you just have one degree in something like cybersecurity, which is meant to train 50 plus different types of occupations. I think that really begs the question around, do we need much more specialised types of training in cybersecurity? And I think a related issue is, how do we then try and find that cohort who have the greatest potential for maximising these KSAs for particular types of cyber roles? And I'm going to touch on some ideas for that in the next couple of slides. In Australia, I guess as many countries are facing at the moment, there is a real skills crisis around trying to find the right number of cybersecurity staff who have the right qualifications, who can then fight against these highly capable and well-funded adversaries from other countries. And we are certainly a target, both for financial reasons, for democratic reasons. Some of the work that I've done over the years has looked at the indirect and direct losses for something like a data breach, and it can be quite significant, particularly the indirect costs for not handling a cyber incident correctly can be very, very significant for a company's reputation. And certainly in Australia, there have been a very large number of reports for cybersecurity incidents that have taken place over the years, particularly with a view to stealing intellectual property. And really, for various reasons, I think the main one being that people outside cybersecurity, particularly students, intending students, might view cyber as something that's done by a young male in a hoodie, which is probably very far from the truth, at least commercially. That there's really a lack of suitable people to train, people who understand the fundamentals, who can really get into the TCP/IP stack, they understand the internals of an operating system. At the same time, people who've got a legal and policy background who can interpret things like GDPR or Privacy Act regulations. And also, there are really fun areas in ICT at the moment. So things like blockchain, for example, which must seem much more exciting than, say, working with a cybersecurity audit or a checklist. So one of the things that, I guess I and other people have been working on is looking at a whole range of novel strategies to try and engage non-traditional cohorts to move into cybersecurity. So, there have been a number of initiatives around engaging women and girls in cyber, retraining existing workers with some kind of transitional degree or certification, national kind of cyber games and events to try and stimulate interest in cybersecurity. What I've been working on primarily for a couple of years is working with neurodiverse cohorts. So typically these are people who are on the autism spectrum, and one of the observations that you can make about autism and cybersecurity is that a lot of the press reports that tend to be around people who get convicted for hacking is that they rely on what's called the autism defense. They say that, one of the traits of neurodiverse people is having intense curiosity, and often the idea of breaking into something is just innately appealing, even if they don't make any money from it. So I think the challenge with autism spectrum disorder is to try and engage those people to come and become white hats and to try and identify deficiencies in cybersecurity designs and implementations rather than moving on to that dark side of black hat hacking. And so my current research is really all around trying to work out what are the tools and techniques that we need to identify people who've got the best potential and talent for cybersecurity education from that neurodiverse cohort. So just to summarise my presentation today, certainly I would say most educators are now fully engaged in digital education, but this has not necessarily been by choice. It is something that has been forced by the physical closure of schools and colleges and university campuses. The COVID emergency has not passed, and so the situation as it stands is likely to be the norm for a number of years. There are certainly challenges around existing technologies and how they integrate with new approaches, new platforms, and really some of those are just mainstream cybersecurity issues around authentication, authorization, integrity, confidentiality. I think the disturbing thing for many education providers is that they don't always have a cyber strategy, and it's not always coherent or practical if it does exist. And also more specifically around cyber education, there is this very pressing policy issue where we need new strategies to fill cyber gaps, cyber roles, to solve the skills crisis, and to do that we need to investigate new cohorts of future workers and really understand how we can design cyber work to best fit their knowledge, skills and abilities. So thank you very much. If anyone wants to get in touch, my email address was on the first slide, or please just Google, and I'll be happy to discuss any of these issues with anyone in the audience. Thank you very much.